Everyone's so quiet already. All right, so welcome to the Best Tutorials track. I'm Lee Lacey from SoarTech, an Accellent company, and I'm going to chair the Best Tutorial team for the Tutorial Subcommittee and this session. We've got 3 tutorials today that represent the best of the 31 tutorials being presented at ITSEC, and one of the 3 will receive the Best Tutorial Award on Thursday night. The deputy chair for this track is Greg Ouellette, a program director at NOC-TSD here in Orlando. A few reminders, please make sure your phone is turned off or silenced. We had an interesting interruption in the last session. The presenters are going to have 80 minutes for their presentation, followed by 10 minutes of questions and answers, so please hold your questions to the end. If you need to leave before the presentation's over, please use the door in the back, not the door on the side. There's to be no flash photography or video recording. You can take some stills of the slides, though, if you're unobtrusive with those. You are eligible for CEU credits. You can get your badge scanned to make sure you get the CEU credits. And in this room, later this afternoon at 4 o'clock will be the ITSEC Fellows presentation. We encourage people to attend that. Greg's going to be handing out some survey forms. Please complete them if you have a chance so that we can improve next year's conference with your feedback. And this session will be followed by the lunch period. It's only 45 minutes, so that's a tight time schedule. There should be some food vendors set up on the second floor. So this next presentation is Quantifying Training Value in the Age of Immersive Simulation. The primary presenter is Sandro Scielzo from CAE. Sandro is an innovator and multidisciplinary scientist in human systems engineering, human factors, instructional systems design, and user experience. He's worked on next-generation training technologies for over 15 years. His co-presenter is Eric Oltes from CAE. And Sandro is also going to be presenting a paper Wednesday morning on the effects of human-machine interface recommendation accuracy on trust when controlling collaborative combat aircraft in complex missions. Their other author is Helly Lin from CAE, who is a machine learning engineer at CAE Orlando. Please join me in welcoming the presenters to the stage.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our tutorial. Eric and I are thrilled that you could join us today. And do you have a particular word for the audience before we begin?
Hey team, so nice to meet you all. 3 things I hope you get out of this today. 1, that you learned something useful, that's why we're here. 2, we have some fun together. We only pass this way once, so try to enjoy our time as you can. 3rd, Sanders want me to tell you this, but there is a quiz at the end, so pay attention. Back to you.
Thanks, Eric. And so that was a spoiler, and now hopefully you're going to pay attention a little bit more closely. But it is our privilege to offer you insights on understanding a little bit better how to improve training value in the age of immersive simulation. So we have 4 great learning objectives for you today. By the end of this tutorial, you will be able to describe immersive technologies and related training gains. You will be able to summarize how to overcome training needs, analysis, limitations. You will be able to identify media costs and capability trade-offs. And finally, you will be able to describe training value index driving factors. So if we do this well, your quiz, you will be stellar. A little bit of Latin first. Let's define immersive simulation. Immersion, from late Latin immersionem, noun of action, from past participle stem of immergere, to plunge in, dip into, sink, submerge. Simulation is the imitative representation of the functioning of one system or process by means of the functioning of another. Let's put these 2 together. Immersive simulation is the action to dip into, to plunge into the imitative representation of a real system. Let that sink in for a moment. Oh, tough audience. We have It's a guy here that tells us that immersive simulation uses technologies such as virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. That's one of the main reasons you're here, is to look at the best of the state-of-the-arts in these domains. And these technologies are aimed to be used to create realistic environments for the learners. But you're here in this tutorial because you want to be able to answer this big question. Do immersive technologies lead to better training? I'm going to give you some quotes. A powerful medium to enhance learning. Provides many benefits, including greater student interest. Promotes higher order thinking skills and discovery. And it is a huge influence in learning and how to think critically. Eric, do you mind putting those quotes into perspective?
Since you asked nicely. Okay, let's start with the first one. We're going to go on a problem-solving technology cycle time graph. So on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have learning. We're going to start with the first quote. A powerful medium to enhance training. Any ideas, venture a guess, what that medium was? Any thoughts? The radio. All right, next one, second chance. Provides many benefits, including greater student interest. Any ideas from the audience? Shout it out. What do you got? Television, outstanding. All right, so you're seeing a trend here, right? A lot of hype about these things in terms of what they can do. Let's go on to the next few. Next one, promotes higher order skills thinking discovery, the PC computer. Next, a huge influence in how to think critically, tablets. Next, the magic of presence changes everything. Very sweeping statement, VR. This media will be the single largest innovation that will change the nature of learning. Pretty dramatic, augmented reality. Next, this medium will let us learn in ways that aren't otherwise possible or practical, mixed reality. And my future one, that's my favorite one so far. This will enhance learning by simulating touch and motion. Thank you, Ready Player One. All right, the question is though, do immersive technology, so XR, lead to better training? And then how do you know? Beware the shiny toy syndrome. You're gonna see this little guy, this little red robot. He's red because he's cool. He's also red because it's an indication of danger. If you see something that's too good to be true, it possibly is. For example, training that's based on AR, VR, MR, or extended reality for short, can be very, very shiny without empirical evidence they actually are improving performance and learning outcomes. So let's take it to the Gartner hype cycle. This was built in the mid-90s, about 1995 timeframe in terms of, hey, so we have this new technology insertion. Kind of runs like this, right? It's a pattern behavior. It starts with a technology trigger. You can go back to the radio, television, AR, VR. We'll just talk with XR an example, right? Technology trigger for VR, for example, about 2012, 2013, Lucky Palmer came out with the Oculus Rift 1. People said, hey man, that could do everything. Goes up on that great hype cycle. Peak of inflated expectations with no real data or science behind it. More of a, I think we can do everything. I'm gonna go test it out. We get through that little point of discovery. We get into the inflection point. Now everyone's trying to figure out how to use this thing, right? And then we get down to the next level. That peak drops down to the trough of disillusionment. When I was actually working on the Oculus, I bought the thing very early after it came out. I was one of the early adopters. And I found through testing and trial and error, a lot of the data coming back was saying it's actually not changing performance outcomes at all, for better or for worse. It's just there. So I was in my room, listening to the Cure's Integration album, feeling sorry for myself, when I had an epiphany. When I looked at the data again, not all the data was bad. It was just some of the mediums in terms of data outcomes weren't productive. Others, however, had some promise that leads to the slope of enlightenment. Yeah, it's not good for everything, but there are some things it's very good at. And we have to go focus on those areas and keep doing trial and error and get some studies with empirical evidence it's actually working. From that point on, we get to a plateau of productivity. We're going into a test of saying what's there, how good is it, how bad is it, what can I do, what evidence can I do, and replicate that to demonstrate it in other environments. The one I want you to focus on right here though, is slope of enlightenment. This is an area of saying, hey, I could do everything, it could do nothing, it could do some things pretty well. This is that sweet spot of saying, well, what can it do and how do I know it can do that? How can I replicate that? Moving on towards a new training landscape, we're gonna talk about a history of training value, new technology changing training solutions, in this example, immersive technology, and finally, immersive sim and training games. Sandro, you want to go from here?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. And now let's start the first section of your tutorial with your learning objective displayed here. So think about a history of training throughout mankind. What is by far the best model of instruction throughout the ages? Think of something. The best model by far is the master and the apprentice model. So here's a fictional example which works great for us. You have a master, Mr. Miyagi, that trains this young apprentice, Daniel-san, in acquiring complex karate skills to great effect. And the great thing about master-apprentice model, the master imparts his or her philosophies to the student. And here's a quote: "There's no such thing as a bad student, only a bad teacher. The teacher says, the student does." You may agree or disagree with this quote, but what we can all agree on is that one-on-one training is superior. However, it is also by far the most expensive. What is the performance increment of one-on-one training versus traditional forms of training? Well, let's introduce the 2 sigma problem. On the x-axis, you have student proficiency, y-axis, number of students. Let's plot the distribution curve of traditional training. Think classroom instruction, for example. And now let's plot one-on-one training. Now pay attention to the averages between those 2 curves. There's quite a bit of distance. As a matter of fact, there are 2 standard deviations worth of distance between the 2 distribution means. And standard deviation, also known as sigma, is represented here as the 2 sigma problem. So the entire goal of science and technology is to create new instructional methods that leverage technology well enough to start closing that gap, so you don't have to rely on master apprentice all the time, because you're going to get broke real soon. Okay, let's go back to traditional training value proposition. I have a question for you. Due to world wars, what is the one key technological innovation that contributed more than any other to the evolution of pilot training? Hint, you're at the right conference. It's all over the place. So think about the answer. Somebody wants to spit it out? Yes, the simulator. And here the example with aviation training. Ed Link created the Blue Boxer in 1929 and virtually trained every aviator since. So great value with this, because when compared to flying instruction in an airplane, now you have safe training. You have increased throughput. You can buy a lot more of those than you can buy the actual real platforms. You can have standardized proficiency, and it is way cheaper than aircraft sorties. So ladies and gentlemen, ground-based training was born. Great, but how does that relate to the 2 sigma problem? Good question. So remember I mentioned about science and technology as the drivers to close that gap? So from a learning sciences standpoint, the field of instructional system design brought to you training needs analysis to yield learning objectives that were then paired to the right media for you to acquire the skills at the right level of proficiency, all bundled up in a good curriculum. From a simulation technology standpoint, well, we've seen the increase in fidelity and technology over the decades to end up with incredibly complex high-fidelity simulation devices like you see the one pictured here. So what does that mean when you have to build a ground-based training system? Well, let's look at let's call it modern ground-based training system, which will mix different media and different ratios of student and instructors. Typically, you start in the classroom. This is the highest ratio, the lowest fidelity, but the lowest cost as well. Then we move to the infamous computer-based training. Ratio not really applicable because there's no human instructor. Fidelity still relatively low. There can be a little bit of interactivity, but that's about it. But at least the cost is still on the lower end. These two together typically are best served for knowledge-based training. Let's move up. We next move to part test trainers. They come in many flavors. Represented here is just an example. Ratio can be up to 1-to-1, one instructor, one student. Fidelity, now you start climbing up the fidelity ladder a little bit, but you're also starting to climb the cost ladder a little bit. Now let's move to high fidelity simulation. Oh boy, lately those simulations cost a pretty penny. Ratio definitely 1-to-1, fidelity high, but cost is also high. And then you want to cap your instruction with ground-based training in the actual platforms, in this case, an aircraft, 1-to-1 ratio, fidelity, of course, you're flying the real thing, but then the cost is also tremendous. You can imagine, I don't have to tell you the costs that incur into aircraft sorties. So, how can I optimize one-on-one training and achieve proficiency requirements? Eric, do you want to enlighten on this?
Yes, Andrew. So we're going to start off traditional mode, how we do training today. We're going to use aviation training as a good example. So we got Timmy here. He's going to start off as a novice. He's going to learn to be a pilot. And he's going to end off getting his wings. So how does he get there? So we have the academic classroom environment with CBTs, as Sandra talked about. Lockstep, one-size-fits-all traditional training back from World War II time frame. We go into part task trainers with some aircraft interspersed in there. It's limited training capability, but actually is building up to higher fidelity, which moves into your high fidelity sims that Sandra talked about, interspersed with aircraft events. And then you top it off with your aircraft events to get your heavy reliance on those, competencies, skills, knowledges, aptitudes you have to accomplish. But what if we can optimize that, change that from the traditional mode to something a little bit better? Then we look at, if we take the promise immersive simulation and take out some of those CBTs and academic instruction and PTTs and go into, for those familiar with instructional and design perspective, interactive multimedia instruction, level 1 through 4. Traditionally training, level 1 is kind of like your PowerPoint prezos, level 2, limited interaction, level 3, complex interaction, and level 4 is complex real-time interaction. Through these immersive simulation, you can accomplish more of the higher level IMI, which actually can left load your skills in that training earlier. Then moving on from there, you take out some of that academic time, so that knowledge can then be incorporating some early skills development. From there, you take out some of your sims because you're left loading from the higher level training, get some companies moved over left from those high level sims, get that cost down. And what you get is a reduced need for the classroom. So again, that student-instructor ratio for fourth generation, you're reducing demand on the instructor. It takes over some of that CBT and downloads training tasks from higher fidelity sims. So you're moving some of the, oftentimes most complained about, components of training is a self-paced CBT perspective, and then left loading some expensive training down. You still retain your high fidelity sims for advanced skills and developing your competencies to a level of proficiency that's tied to your syllabus structure. And then finally, you're focusing on your aircraft events to top off for check rides, rec rides, and anything for more advanced competencies you want to go practice and get moderation for seasoning purposes. So that's it, right? Immersive simulation is the answer. Objective complete. Not quite, but wait, there's more. The question still remains, but how exactly is immersive simulation changing the training landscape? Remember I commented before, what evidence do I have it's actually improving learning outcomes and training performance? Tell me if you've heard this before. Small footprint, low cost, covers 80% of your training task. I've seen this, you've probably seen this, we've heard it on the floor, we've seen it on the floor, we've seen that throughout acquisition for defense security for years, right? But what does it mean? What does it apply to? More importantly, is it too good to be true? This goes back to my original statement. Beware the shiny toy system, or is it really warfighter ready? And again, how do you know? Empirical evidence is the only way you're going to know if this actually works for you or not. Otherwise, it's just talk. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sandra to talk about disruptor for training need.
All right. So let's look at immersive simulation as a group. how it came about to disrupt the traditional training media landscape. So we're going to put time on the x-axis and product performance on the y-axis. And here's your band of training needs, with the top representing the high-end market to satisfy higher-level training requirements, and the bottom representing your low-end market to satisfy your initial familiarization, etc. What happened over time is that your traditional media, and think about your high-fidelity simulators, they kept moving up market, beyond training needs, adding capabilities on capabilities to fight each other's off from a competitive standpoint. But what does that mean for you, the learner? I'm going to give you 2 examples of high-fidelity simulation that goes beyond the training need. Nowadays, you can have beautiful image generators where the wind can blow in the tree branches and the blades of grass, they sway, and it's gorgeous. Yes, the wow factor is there. You see it, shiny toy for sure. But tell me how a fast jet pilot cares about blades of grass swaying in the wind. Not that much, right? So this is an example. I'm going to give you another example. 10 years ago, a team of engineers came to me and said, hey, Sandro, we want to show you something great. We have created physically accurate aircraft contrails that look fantastic. And I saw it, they looked great, it was amazing, they were really proud of their job. I asked a question. Now tell me, how does that help the pilot complete their training tasks? And they looked at me a little bit deflated. Hence the importance of human factors instructional system design. They put a lot of time, energy, and money to develop capabilities that may not necessarily be needed in a training environment. So this is what happened with high-fidelity simulation. This kind of warfare of capabilities allowed disruptive technologies, such as immersive sim using AR, VR, XR that Eric talked about, to build and little by little get mature enough to enter the market. You see there, when that blue line crosses the training needs, this is when, theoretically, that type of new capability can start disrupting the traditional media market. So if we had to put a year on that inflection point, think about a year. There's many good answers on that one, but I picked 2017. I saw a vast adoption of those immersive technologies by programs of record starting around that date, plus or minus a few years. So, what does it all mean? Let's go back to the hype cycle for a second. Where would you plot that year, 2017? Look at the cycle, look at this curve. I personally pick right after inflated expectations. We're so excited about what this technology can bring us to make training more affordable, better, so on and so forth. But inflated expectations are still present. Since 2017 and now, we traveled through the trough of disillusionment. Eric mentioned, we saw it, we thought it was going to be great and answer all the training needs we needed, but then we realized that some things it's not good at and some other things it's really great at. So it disrupted the market through hype a little bit, but then it got integrated via science. And this is why we believe that right now we're finally reaching that slope of enlightenment. If you use science and technology properly, you can definitely use immersive media the best way it can be leveraged based on its capabilities. So you may ask yourself, is there an evidence-based method to assess immersive simulation benefits? Well, you're sitting in this tutorial because you probably want to learn a thing or two about this, so the answer is going to be yes. Let's talk about this in terms of trade-offs. So here's a notional simulator on the left-hand side, and we're going to look at a number of trade-offs for immersive media that you need to pay closely attention to. The first one is, of course, the footprint. You can literally just put an Oculus on and sit on a chair and get into virtual environment. That is probably the lowest footprint you can have. But nowadays, you've seen it, you can get to pretty large footprints for immersive simulators as well that are arguably at a competitive level with high-fidelity sims. So this is a trade-off, and the trade-off is going to drive cost. Next trade-off. We talked about image generation, the quality, the headset. We've seen it over the past decade and more. Those headsets keep getting better and better in terms of resolution, in terms of field of view, so on and so forth. But you still have a choice out there. What really drives cost, though, is the image generation. What kind of visual models? If you need to really pay attention to some sensory data, how is it going to be projected in high fidelity, or is it just going to be an approximation? So if you really want that high fidelity visuals, that's going to drive cost. So an important trade-off for you to consider. Next one, model fidelity. Talking about weapons, avionics, right? These need to be really accurate. If you train with approximate models, perhaps it's good enough in some instances for a familiarization type training, but in most cases, it's not going to be great and can actually induce negative training. So think about it, because approximation, game-based type physics and fidelity versus an operational flight program, which is the real deal of a platform that you operate, that is definitely going to drive cost. Let's move on to physical versus virtual ratio. Well, you see an example here. There's a lot of physical metal around you. And the main instrument display is also touch. But for example, we see that the side consoles, if there's a top consoles, it's probably all virtual. You touch through air to activate whatever you need to engage with. So that is another important trade-off that you need to consider that will also drive cost. And finally, aircraft controls and loadings, if we go with the aircraft example. So think about it. You're in a vehicle. The controls that you use all the time, in this case, is going to be rudder pedals, stick and throttle. If you don't have the right loadings, that's negative training. You learn the wrong muscle memory. So yes, it can be a lot cheaper to just get commercially available devices for the rudder, the stick, and the throttle, or whatever controls you have, but they're not going to lead to a good training experience, and therefore also drives cost. You saw the two cautions appearing down below with negative training highlighted. Well, all of these trade-offs, if poorly implemented, can lead to negative training. But Eric and I, we've conducted over the past years several experiments. We've field tested some of these technologies with allied forces across the globe. And students, they do not like when you don't have accurate physicality that you need to engage with often. If it's an obscure panel that you reach once in a blue moon, virtual is perfectly fine. If not, you need to really consider the importance and frequency of that particular device that you need to achieve training with. So this is really important, because then the impact of all these trade-offs are going to be manifested in training gains. So based on the trade-offs that you have, and hopefully you have some good front-end analysis that led to your selection of the right trade-offs that you need for your training program. Well, in this case, with what we selected, we say, hey, we can cover a significant portion of the training tasks, but we're going to reach, let's say, an average level of proficiency with it, right? How can you measure all that? We need to make sure that this training task coverage and proficiency needs need to be well defined, hence the learning readiness measures. In this case, they are. But what we really need is a training needs analysis. And before Eric's going to go into detail about that, let's wrap up this section. A new training landscape, a recap. This was your learning objective, to describe relationship between disruptive and incremental technologies and associated training gains. We first learned about the Two Sigma model, what it means. We then looked at the promise of immersive simulation, and Eric described how some of that capability, when properly implemented, can definitely disrupt the traditional media environment. We explained how that came about and how some high-end, high-fidelity traditional media are starting to get disrupted by this immersive capabilities. And we finally talked about the trade-offs that you absolutely have to consider in order to get a good sense of what training you can achieve. And for an overview of training needs analysis, I'll pass it on to Eric.
Okay, so before we get started, I want to make a quick note. We're talking about synthetic training using a use case of aviation training. I know several services within the room, several countries. Thank you all for being here. This applies to any use case. We're using one as kind of an exemplar, if you will. This will apply to the Army, the Navy, all forces around the world. With that, I'm actually going to do an overview of augmenting the training needs analysis, TMA, and so forth. So, quick overview of traditional TNA. We'll talk about the training cycle. Then we'll talk about the TNA, training needs analysis limitations. And then including the, what I can see, what I can feel, what I can hear. And then we'll talk about augmenting the training needs analysis to incorporate things for synthetic learning and immersive training. I apologize in advance. We intentionally made the Trivia Man a Ken doll, just not to offend anybody in the room. So we'll see him a few times at the presentation. Okay, with that in mind, high level, this will not be applicable for all the same way because we're looking at all services. So I'm using the DoD reference point from a Mill Handbook 2612, which talks about MTA, TRA, OMA, TISBA. I'll explain more in detail for those who don't have a background in structural system design or learning engineering. So we start off with the mission task analysis. It talks about the platforms. What weapon system or training system I'm actually going into. Again, doesn't have to be aviation. It could be any type of training environment. How many roles, how many variants do I have? Second, what kind of missions? Is it multi-mission? Is it single mission? What do they have to be able to do? Under what conditions do they have to perform? Up to what standard? What training tasks do they have to accomplish? We identify those through SME interviews, task analysis, and develop our master task list. Then we go in from the mission task analysis into the training requirements analysis. And through there, we're going to identify the requirements that perform the job. So this is going to be all the jobs applicable to do that aircraft or vehicle or weapon system, training system, down to the mission and multi-mission profiles they have to accomplish. Now we're talking about the jobs. What are the jobs, MOSs, AFSCs, or their variants or equivalents would have to be? What's their training level? What mission readiness level do they have to get to at the end of this training? Second, we've got the skills, knowledges, and abilities. Also, which is becoming more popular these days, competencies, right? So in this use case, information management, 5th and 6th gen training, we don't look at things like, I don't know, keeping up foreign relations would be a good example here from the screen. Next, objective and media analysis, the OMA. This is probably one of the more interesting parts of this and probably key to how we'd actually apply this for immersive training, synthetic training environment. Because we're actually latching on to learning objectives, developing what they are, developing hierarchies, and attaching them to our media. So what can it train? To what level? If you remember the hype cycle, we think we can do everything. Now we're figuring I can't do anything. This is where we figure out through the OMA what it can and do and to what level it can do it with empirical evidence. So we're establishing our enabling and terminal objectives. We're identifying our media, and from standards perspective, from a human factors, learning engineering perspective, we're also looking at the sensory analysis required and the media mapping we have to accomplish to get there for things I can see, hear, feel, touch. And finally, we develop our training syllabus within the learning objective hierarchy, our curriculum, and our flow of training of what we're going to accomplish to achieve those outcomes. From there, we do a TISBA, the training system-based analysis. This is really the overarching, the culmination of all these other reports, all these other studies. It identifies what the student throughput is going to be, the resource loaded schedules, how much I can train, how many devices I have to have, and what flavor. And also I determine my ground-based training system. What is my media composition gonna look like? What are my customer trade-offs in terms of I'm the customer, I wanna have more of this or less of that, I have this cost constraint, but I have to achieve this amount of training. These are the criteria you say, I want that, but I don't want that. Here are the trade-offs I'm going to accomplish to achieve that training. So, the TNA leads to optimized training. What's the issue of immersive simulation? How do we measure it? How is it measured today? Right now, not quite effectively. That's part of the challenge we're having today. Oh, hey, Timmy. Great question. It's almost like you knew to ask that question at this exact time. Yes, it is because TNAs traditionally, they're old methods. These mean World War II era type activities. They haven't accounted for the emerging technology, and not just immersive simulation. Every new technology that goes through that hype cycle has a hard time going through the cycle in terms of where to incorporate it, how much, and for how long, and what's the right price to do so. With that, I'm going to hand over to Sando to cover the next topic, if you don't mind.
All right, absolutely. Thank you, Eric. I thought you were going to steal my slide for a second. So let's look at instructional system design gaps, and specifically TNA limitations in terms of assessing immersive media. So there are unique immersive simulation factors that ISD methods cannot properly capture, and we're going to go through some examples right now. First one you see here, that sense of immersion. You definitely want a great sense of immersion, but what does that mean? Some of you may have heard the term proprioception. Who's heard the term proprioception? Raise your hand. There you go. Excellent. Yeah, it's your body's ability to sense its position, movement, and action without relying on visual cues. The whole concept of flying by the seat of your pants, that is proprioception in a nutshell. Suspension of disbelief, another popular term. It reflects a temporary loss of awareness of the real world and the immersion into an alternate reality. I love the movie night example at the theater. You watch a great movie, you love it. You're forgetting that you're drinking your soda, eating your popcorn, and sitting with an audience next to you. Your mind is 100% in that movie. You are fully in suspension of disbelief. Failure leads to cyber sickness and negative training, and let's see why. Proprioception needs to be assessed properly. It reflects the extent to which the virtual environment maps to the physical one. So going back to the fly by the seat of your pants, well, that seat is really important because if you're sitting in an office chair with a VR headset flying a high fidelity asset and your body senses that the sitting position, it's not what it sees in the cockpit, for example, that's going to create a discrepancy that will lead to a negative training type of environment. And now let's look at suspension of disbelief. We need to assess factors that can detract from sustained immersion. I'm going to give you two examples of failure. No, one good example of failure of suspension of disbelief, and another is going to be a great example of good suspension of disbelief. So imagine that you are in an immersive simulation and you're operating an asset, and all of a sudden the frame rates, they start lagging, and you catch that from your peripheral vision. At best, you're going to get eye fatigue, strain. At worst, you're going to get sick, and you're going to need a barf bag. So definitely, that's going to take you out of suspension of disbelief. So motion and frame rates are key in this example. We've determined a long time ago, about 10 years ago, that you really want to hit that 90 hertz or above, right? Mostly for the peripheral vision, and Eric's going to talk about that in a moment. But now I'm going to give you a good example. A few years back, we conducted an experiment with F-18 pilots in an immersive environment. It was an F-18 cockpit, and we used some advanced virtual environment at the time, and they had to fly long duration missions. So we really looked at fatigue over time using this type of technology. And this is an anecdote. At some point, halfway through a long mission where not much was happening, an F-18 pilot in the cockpit tried to rest his arms on the canopy rails, and then they fell down. It's like, oh my God, I thought I was in the real thing, and right? So that is the type of immersion that you want to achieve. You need to get lost in that environment and feel that it's real in order to maximize that training. All right, let's move to another term, or in this case, an artifact that needs to be taken into consideration carefully. Finger tracking accuracy. Much less of an issue now, but again, when we introduce these immersive technologies, many of you probably tried some products and, oh, I need to enter comb frequencies or use chiclets around a display, and you hit the wrong thing. What happens if you hit the wrong thing? Well, it's going to frustrate you, number one. And if you use this in a training environment, then you get negative training again, because now your workload goes up, you have frustration, and you lose track of what you need to do. So this is an example of an element of immersion that you really need to keep at its best. And by at its best, the rule of thumb presented here says that tracking needs to have sub-millimeter accuracy. That's very thin. Let's look at this additional term here, haptic congruency, also known as visio haptic congruency. A quote that I have here, you can quote me on this one. What I touch in a virtual environment is consistent with what it looks like and where it's at. Your rule of thumb is that frequently occurring high important training tasks require high haptic congruency. Let me give you an example. Remember when we talked about the trade-off that your controls and forces and loadings need to be accurate? Well, we were conducting an experiment, and we realized that most cadets in this example were getting frustrated with a simple task such as takeoff, because in that immersive environment, the fidelity was a lot of virtual and very little physicality. And imagine a cadet learning to do a takeoff. Everybody has to learn to do a takeoff the first time, right? So they were trying to reach for that landing gear, and it was virtual. It wasn't there. They were fumbling with it. They were looking where it was at. That would break their cross-check, and they would perform poorly. And this is a great instance of you understanding that some aspect of immersive simulation with high virtual versus low physical ratio, you still need to preserve those key characteristics that lead to a good training environment. All right, let's talk about the sensory analysis for a second, and Eric mentioned that. So from a human factor standpoint, this is really important, because in order to understand the level of proficiency that you can train a particular task at, you need to define the level of sensory fidelity it needs to achieve. And there are multiple correct answers based on the level of proficiency you want to gain. But let's talk about our takeoff example again. In this case, from a visual stimulus standpoint, you need high fidelity environment. From an auditory standpoint, you can get away with even no sound. But from a haptic standpoint, as we mentioned, in this case, you would need a high fidelity environment as well. What you touch is what you feel. So what kind of traditional media can typically serve that task at that level of proficiency? Your high fidelity simulation and the actual vehicle as well, of course. But in order to really understand these concepts a little bit more, I'm going to have Eric provide you a couple examples.
Sure. So some practical examples we can apply to this for sensory analysis limitations and what to get from a learning engineering perspective is looking from ISD, human factors, data science, figure out, but what am I trying to accomplish objectively? So in this case, we'll play with field of view, right? So your field of view, as Sandra mentioned earlier, with these kids going out, they're getting better and better field of view, but are they applicable to the use case I'm trying to apply to? And how do I measure for that? So an example of aviation training, we have looked at things like formation flight, spotting traffic. I'm a prior aviator myself in the US military, cross-checks and judging distances. If I don't have the right field of view and I can't see off my wingtip, I'm gonna have a very hard time figuring out this training if it's actually applicable to my use case. I may get limit training, or as mentioned earlier by Sandro, I could be inducing negative training, which is why not just your core vision, but peripheral vision is so critical because you're applying all of those skills together and your abilities to achieve a learning outcome. Next, we'll look at reach envelopes. So this ties back, again, to very much in human factors, human-machine teaming, human interface, ensuring my arms and lengths envelope are applicable so they are where I say they are, where I think they are, especially if I have a kit on my head or any kind of immersive simulation. If I'm reaching out on my HOTAS, for example, it has to be there at the right level. Otherwise, I'm out of my suspended disbelief. I'm looking forward, I'm fumbling around. I'm not getting the training I want to accomplish. So along those lines, my management panel, my HUD, my HDDs as applicable, and my HOTAS as mentioned. If those aren't where they need to be, and I'm looking for them, I can't find them, or they're completely virtualized, and should it be physically there versus simulated, those are things that are going to cause issues with your haptic congruency, and again, can induce negative transfer of learning. All right, so let's go for a quick recap. We talked about the TNA in terms of the needs for it, how we account for it for immersive training simulation, such as XR. We talked about all the different variables of traditional TNA and the importance of doing a good OMA, a media analysis, to make sure you're training the right things at the right level with the right media in mind. We talked about the sensory analysis limitations. Sandra talked about stimulus versus the media and how important they are depending on what activity you're performing. And then we talked about combining ISD, human factors, learning engineering principles to ensure that we're applying empirical evidence to perform an outcome. With that, we're going across the media trade capability.
No, you can take this one, you're good.
All right. So let's talk about the big meeting factor. So what about AI? It's the elephant in the room, right? We're going to see it here on the floor. We're going to see it in the papers. We're going to see it in some of the tutorials. Here's the thing, though. How do we know AI is actually going to achieve the outcome? It's very much in that same inflection point that we talked about before in the Gartner hype cycle. We don't know where it's at yet. We're probably still on that upward curve. We haven't got to the downward curve just yet. So just be cautious of that. We'll also talk through the visualizing trade-offs in terms of opt-out and composition and where they go. So this is important to make sure we understand, but what does it look like and how do we account for it?
All right,
So
I'm going to
now
take you
I'll
off the
back.
point. Yeah.
All right.
It likes to talk. So, thank you for your attention thus far. Now, again, these are critical elements that you need to understand. And the question I want to ask you is, do you remember the master and the apprentice model that we presented at the beginning of this tutorial? Right? It's the most effective, it's the most costly, unless it's all over the conference this year, AI. They use AI in this particular case as surrogates to be AI instructor pilots with immersive simulators, and it is touted as a powerful way to close the 2 sigma gap. Why? It can reduce instructor workload, actual human instructor workload, by having students perform repeated tasks over and over and not tasking that human instructor too much over the course of the instruction. You can standardize basic skills. You can support adaptive training, provide real-time coaching, and prevent negative training. Wow. Again, that sounds wonderful. So our AI instructors, the next big thing, they are rapidly maturing, but, like Eric said, beware of the shiny toy syndrome. What you need to ensure is that they are based on field-tested technology, and we cannot stress this enough. Whenever you see emerging technologies being used, you need to ask, show me the data, right? Because you can get a pitch or you can get a slide deck that's going to convince you it's phenomenal, but if you do not see the data that proves that it's better than your standard training environment, then perhaps it's not mature enough. And you need to start adopting when the technology and the science gets there to use AI in a proper way to generate good instructor pilots. And finally, you need to verify that they have a high human learning readiness level. But before we get into that, Eric, do you mind giving us an idea of media trade-off visualizations?
Sure. Okay, so many of you guys may have heard of human readiness level. I know DoD came out with that recently this year saying that is now, along with track readiness level, human readiness level is now being measured officially. I see Kevin Owens in the room. I'm going to call him out for learning readiness measures. He's actually briefing that this week, I believe on Wednesday. That is actually taking the technology, which is just what the systems do, the human-machine interface and teaming in terms of how they incorporate with the human about like field of view, where it is physically. Now we're actually talking about, but did I learn anything? And how do I know? How do I measure that effectively for a learning outcome perspective? With that in mind, we're going to look at the visual aid trade-on for optimizing. So we're going to look at, again, at a quick chart, x-axis, traditional media fidelity, and then magnitude. And then we'll have the red is cost, blue is proficiency. First one, CBTs. Again, pretty low cost, pretty low fidelity in terms of magnitude of training. Second, part task trainers, a little bit higher in terms of capability, but also higher cost. And then finally, your high fidelity sims, very expensive, but you can get most, if not all, of your training accomplished in that training environment. Next, we'll look at a comparison. What happens if I use immersive simulation fidelity in contrast? Well, my low-end simulation is higher than my CBTs, because as I said before, I can have higher MI accomplished within that easier. My immersive simulations are higher than my part task trainer, because I can go back and apply the synthetic and the physical together in an environment. And while I'm not as quiet as the high end on the full flight simulation, a high immersive simulation does offset and can start left loading some of my training off those full big sims I already have in place into the higher level sim device, so it'll be a lower cost from an immersion perspective. I'm going to jump through this next part a little bit quickly, but I want to make sure I make some key points here. We have AI synthetic instructors. Don't believe the hype. Got to verify with data and facts and evidence first. And then the Vitruvian man with human race level, as I said before, this is now being measured against with TRLs, HRLs. It's important that it's actually useful for the humans to be able to perform the learning outcome. Next, and there's 9 levels of the HRL. Well, hey, Timmy. Yes, technology is important, but it's not everything. The human is always in the loop at some level. You have to account for the human if humans being trained. But also, going back to learning readiness measures, there's a flower here, flower petal has each of these. It may be hard to see on the screen, but what that represents is different disciplines. All of these disciplines, engineering, instructional design, human factors, data science, SMEs, et cetera, they're all coming together at that core to have a shared understanding of what they're trying to accomplish, and the focus is always and always should be the learner, which is that bottom leaf. Training's not done to the learner, it's done through them and by them. So if we're not factoring this in our equations in terms of how we're incorporating our training development design, we're missing the point entirely. And then on the right-hand side here, you see, again, another scale for the learning readiness measures. It's actually going from the low end to the high end in terms of things you have to show for maturity from a human readiness level, a tech readiness level, in this case, learning readiness. Did I achieve the learning readiness? So it kind of mashes up a lot of great concepts like the Kirkpatrick model, data science, adaptive learning, saying, but when and where should they apply, and how do I know? Timmy again, always on point. Yes, learning readiness measures are key to optimizing media composition. Without having these incorporated, you do not know with any kind of evidence that you can accomplish a learning outcome, which kind of misses the whole point. Okay, so we talked about the novice to expert. The thing I want you guys to walk away from, core element, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, I want you to remember these couple points. Any training that you put, whether it's virtual immersion, AI, doesn't matter. It has to be proven to be more training effective. I can do more training. Training efficient, I can do training faster, and or it's more cost effective than my traditional models, meaning I'm doing it at a cost method. If I'm incorporating something new, pick something from the floor today you see all this week. If you put it in your training system today, and it doesn't add value, statistically add value from a training effectiveness, training efficiency, or cost effectiveness, you added 0 value to your training program. All right, with that, a quick recap. We'll summarize what we got through. So we went over the media costs and capability trade-off. We talked about AI instructions, potentially the next big thing, but beware of the shiny toy syndrome. We had a short recap of the cost capability trade-off through normal and immersive simulation fidelity. And we talked about value proposition for immersive simulation, remember, effectiveness, efficiency, cost effectiveness. With that, we're gonna go into the value index modeling.
All right, and this is the last section of the tutorial, and hopefully the moment you've all waited for, you are going to hopefully be able to describe the driving factors for training value indexing of immersive media. So what we're going to show in this section is how you build media profiles first. How you can use those media profiles to build indices and allow comparisons between media, and how you can then use those comparisons to decide how can that affect your training continuum. So let's look at media profiles. Pretty straightforward because you've seen all of these concepts. So this is only examples for this tutorial of an immersive simulation on the low end of its capability. So you can see the trade-off that we selected for this particular media, and these are the anticipated capabilities, training capability that it can achieve based on those trade-offs. When you put all this into the Gonculator 5000, you can achieve an index, a training value index, in this case, between 0 and 100 to allow easy comparisons, and define TVI across immersion, training, and cost. We've done this for the low end. Let's do it with the mid-level immersive sim environment. You can see trade-offs creeping up a little bit more towards the costlier part of the scale, but then you achieve higher training capabilities, and it also reflects in your TVI scores. You then move to your high-end immersive simulation environment, and you can see the trend. With the trade-offs, again, moving up the cost scale, but then significantly impacting training capabilities that are also reflected in those TVI training value index scores. Great. Now we have media profiles for immersive environments. You can also apply them to traditional environments. Your infamous or famous computer-based training environment doesn't get a lot of love from the TVI, very little immersion, some training, and relatively low cost. When you use part-test trainer, and again, this is a notional example, you can see you get better scores here overall, but also higher cost. And then higher fidelity simulation. This is kind of your Cadillac full motion systems or weapon systems. You get really high scores. Great. Now you have your profiles. What are we going to do with those? Well, here in this example, we're going to use immersive simulation low end, your low end immersive sim device, against computer-based part-test trainers and high fidelity sims. We're going to plot them on this whiteboard right here. X-axis traditional media, Y-axis we're going to plot our index for simulation training and cost. And the way we're plotting this, anything that lands on the top part is better, and anything that lands at the bottom is worse. So when comparing low-end immersive sim against CBT, we get much better sim and training, of course, but then it's a worse cost. When we plot that low end against PTT, you can see that simulation and training, it's kind of there, but the cost is better. So you can already see your opportunity point right here. You compare it to high fidelity motion sims though, and then of course you cannot achieve the sim or the training even if the cost is significantly better. So now we're gonna do the same exercise, but with the mid-range. And with the mid-range, now you can see those comparisons against CBT, PTT, and high fidelity sim. And again, you can see some opportunity areas right here with PTT and perhaps even a little bit with sim. And finally, now we're going to plot your high-end immersive sim media against CBT, PTT, and high-end fidelity simulation. And again, you can see where those opportunity points are, mostly in downloading training tasks from the sim. Now you have a data-driven way of identifying that. So with this in mind, what's the impact on your training environment, Eric?
Well, I'm proud to say, as working through this, I know you guys are being patient, I appreciate that. We're halfway there, in the famous words of John Bon Jovi. I'm kidding, we're on the final stretch. We're almost there, guys. Stay with us. So as we close this out, we're going back to that old model again. So looking at the low-end simulation, what does that do? So if I take out those areas here for the CBT and some of my part-task trainers, and replace those with my immersive simulology, it augments training value, so it actually offsets that cost, gets more training, accomplishes more training effectively, and training faster at a cost-effective rate. From a mid-range perspective, It replaces some of my hard task trainers and some of my higher sims and even maybe potentially aircraft mins, but less likely. And what it does provides me a simulation again, so it's a trade-off in terms of cost, training output, and training efficiency. And then for my high-end simulation, it actually does replace some of my hard task trainer sims and aircraft events, and actually provides against that higher end. So it's not quite at the same level as the sim, so the sim is still there, but it's actually left loading much of that training over into another training environment at a lower cost and a decent or even higher throughput level. Okay, so those combined, if you take all those, the low end, medium, and high end, compared to the traditional trade-off, again, having empirical evidence behind this to incorporate that, it's not just words, you have evidence behind it. You combine those immersive simulation technologies, significant training value, incorporating what I mentioned before in terms of how would you correlate those, how would you compare those with evidence behind them. And again, the important part here, the key takeaway, learning engineering quantifies training value. You cannot do this in a vacuum. We're all in this together, but you have to have learning engineering, so those engineering scientists, those SMEs, instructional system designers, data scientists, human factors, all working together to achieve that common outcome from that flower petal I showed you guys earlier. With that, quick recap, and we're almost there. So training value index, we talked about some modeling in terms of media profiles, indices, and training system impact. We then talked about media profiles, Sandra walked through like the footprint and the training trade-off capabilities. We then talked about training value index modeling. Sandra showed you from low level to high level, from the traditional modes to the immersive simulation. And then finally, we talked about where you can incorporate that simulation from a low end, medium, and high end to offset or replace even some of those traditional training models. With that, I'll let you close it out, buddy.
All right, thank you, Eric, and thank you for your patience. So, of course, there are a ton of resources that we would love for you to be familiar with, but some of the main, I think, volumes that we believe need to be on your bookshelf, some may already be there, are these 4 books right here. The first one is The Innovator's Dilemma. This is a great book that shows the failure of companies not paying attention to disruptive capabilities and losing market dominance. Kodak, anybody? Right?
Too soon.
Yeah, too soon. No, it's been a while. The next one, Zone to Win. So this one adds on top of that previous book by defining the manner in which you can use disruption to provide value and catch the next big wave. So it tells you, again, it's a data-driven approach. How do you provide value? It's not just a shiny toy. So great book, Zone to Win, highly recommended. The next one, Eric introduced several times already, Learning Engineering Toolkit. If you haven't learned about learning engineering yet, please do so, because this is really your multidisciplinary approach that combines instructional system design, human factors, data scientists. We're good.
One of the authors is in the room.
Well, one of the-
Jim Goodell is over there by Kevin, so.
So thank you for being present to this tutorial. Again, great book, highly recommended for you to put on your bookshelf. And the last one, Human Factors Methods. This book provides over 100 methods and front-end analysis. A lot of them that Eric alluded to earlier with your vision, your rich envelopes, your ergonomics, that helps you produce the data that you need to quantify the value for a particular training media. So there could be a lot more that we could advise for you to look at, but those 4 books right here, definitely put them on your bookshelf. All right, so are we done? Are we done?
I promised there's going to be a quiz.
Quiz time, everybody. Okay. So there's going to be 1 question per learning objective. First question will be for the first learning objective, which was to describe immersive technologies and related training gains. True or false? Immersive simulation is proven cost-effective training technology. Show of hands for true. Couple hands. Bit of a trick question. It is false. It has the potential to be cost-effective. But again, it needs to be data-driven in order for you to define that. Next question for the next learning objective, which was summarize how to overcome training needs analysis limitations. we've shown there's a number of limitations. And your question today, true or false? Current ISD training needs analysis capture immersive sim sensory needs well. Show of hands for true?
They're very smart.
Yeah, they are very smart because it is patently false. ISD processes need to be augmented with human factors methods and learning engineering to capture immersive sim sensory requirements. Next learning objective, identify media costs and capability trade-offs. True or false? Pairing AI instruction to immersive sims has the potential to close the Two Sigma gap. Show of hands for true. That's a great audience that really paid attention to your section of the tutorial.
They're very smart.
So it is true, the potential is there, but validating corresponding technologies will be key. And finally, true or false? Immersive sim training value can be gauged quantitatively. Show of hands for true. And it is indeed true. Immersive sim trade-offs and value can be objectively quantified as you've seen in the last section of this tutorial. So ladies and gentlemen, this is it. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for being here, paying attention to this tutorial. Eric and I are thrilled, and at this point we will take any questions you may have. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. Really well done. I appreciate the references as well. So, bridging the gap from the academic and conceptual for immersive sim and qualification of it, what types of documentation and examples, how many are there, maybe in your own experience, or out there that have got the military government moving in the direction of using these types of techniques rather than, well, I just feel like this will be good, but really getting an evidence-based approach to actually make things.
Yeah, I'd say you can take it there, but not enough, right? We need more militaries and industries to standardize the process by which you quantify all of that. And again, the lack is that the traditional methods, like we've seen with instructional system design, are not sufficient. So with a multidisciplinary approach, and again, a data-driven approach, we need to figure out a consensus through IEEE standards, for example, or other standards or new standards on how to achieve a disciplined methodology for quantifying media in a way that can provide the training value you're seeking. Eric?
Great question. So one thing I would say is that it's not there yet, but it's growing. It's going in the right direction. If you go back to the Gartner model, I think we all kind of had that hype of the government did it, industry did, academic, we all did our own fits and starts of how we would do this, how we incorporate it. But to answer your question, what we're finding, and I'm one of the co-chairs, for example, for the Government Military Market Interest Group through IEEE for the International Consortium for Innovation, Collaboration, Learning Engineering, ISCO for short. And through that, that's a collaboration of all governments, all industry, multiple countries, academia. We're identifying what those standards should become. And so I encourage you, in fact, there's a meeting this week on Friday to talk about that in terms of what are those standards, what should they be, working with the IEEE committee to say, hey, how do we incorporate that? And then most importantly, get that through the acquisition cycles, if it's going to be a purchase, or if it's going to be internal investment, IRAD, for example, or just the government saying, I'm going to go back and test this. Going back and applying those principles to achieve those outcomes. So a good use case, which is probably off topic a little bit, but I see it's going in this direction now, is taking the traditional ISD methodology, whether it's DoD-based 29612 or the TISRA for U.S. Navy, U.S. Air Force, every service, the Army, going through what they have for all their ISD documentation. They're also looking at model-based system engineering and incorporating those traditional models into an embassy format to be able to show with empirical evidence what did it actually do versus what I thought it was going to do. So they're actually validating, think OTTI, right? They're doing tests and training at the same time to validate, did it actually work? If not, let me go back and change that cycle much faster than waiting for the next time the TISRA gets updated, which could be 20 years. Does that help answer your question?
That's a great start to the answer. I think what I'd like to do is follow up later. There's a lot of things you touched on that I'd like to open up some more conversation about.
Sure.
But I don't have the time to really thank you for the answer. I appreciate that.
No worries. Anybody else?
We're on this
Go ahead. You said the reference material for the training? Training value index.
The training value
Okay.
index that we presented in the last module. So Eric and I kind of have a little bit of a secret sauce behind it. At the moment, we can definitely provide you with information on the methodology for you to compute that training value index. So feel free to talk to us after the fact. The most important thing we wanted to convey to you is that this index is not perfect yet. It'll have to be refined over the years. But the point was that you can use a data-driven approach to quantify training value. So I think that's the takeaway message that you need to have resonate right now. But if you want to know what happens behind the scenes and how it is calculated, we can definitely talk after the fact.
Right. Yeah, and to pick up on that point, nothing we're talking about here is a tutorial, so it's nothing proprietary. We want to show that, but a large time it's setting up this case to do it correctly. If you set up the conditions incorrectly, you're going to have a bad outcome, right? So what we're doing now is we're going back before we show the full part of it. We're validating those things, saying, hey, but does it actually tie back to the reality for this use case, value case? We want to validate that before we roll it out in its entirety, but we're happy to share our initial preliminary findings with you, 100%. Sir? Yes, I'll be down there probably most of the week, so.
Yep.
Perfect. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
A lot of the simulation technologies, including the simulators and AI, are kind of focusing on ways to convince people that this is more and more real, especially with like the AI features. But have you noticed any like loss in training when the people undergoing it kind of have that realization that like, oh, this isn't real? Like when the guy was looking at the rest of his arms, and then suddenly he's like, oh yeah, this is the simulation. Does that negatively affect the training?
I'll let you start then, I'll top it off.
Yeah, no, for sure. So that example actually used as a good example because you only had a momentary loss of suspension of disbelief because that sense of immersion was great. So it ended up being an indirect measure of, okay, this system really works for that level of immersion. But you're absolutely right. There needs to be more standardized ways in which we need to assess that sense of immersion. And for us, what's important is what kind of human factors methodologies are you going to use to address that instead of anecdotal evidence or, like you said, hey, we're trying to convince you this is a pitch that this technology works great, right? Which needs to be part of the game, of course, right? Industry. But from a data science standpoint, you know, does it work? Does it add that training that you need?
Yeah, so something you addressed along those lines, I want to kind of touch on as well. And Sandra hit on during the presentation, ultra realism does not necessarily equate to better learning performance, better learning outcomes. And as you mentioned on that high end of that model, we're seeing, and multiple companies, ourselves included, are not exempt from this, that there are times you go, wait a minute, I'm having really cool contrails. Great example. Add zero value from a training perspective. I don't care how pretty the contrails are. I don't care about the blades of grass. It's not going to help me take off or land, do something I have to do in terms of a competency. So there's a level of understanding saying, like, these kind of learning engineering scientists have to be incorporated to provide evidence saying, hey, but does that actually achieve an outcome, that's intended outcome? Or is it just a byproduct of what's there? It doesn't actually induce negative learning. It doesn't actually change the outcome. It doesn't actually add cost. It goes back to those three parameters talked about, effectiveness, efficiency, cost effectiveness. Didn't add anything. It's just more of it's there. Doesn't really change the outcome in terms of the data, right? But if it adds a lot of cost, which I tend to find is usually the case, so we have ultra realism, goes to the uncanny valley for even like human avatars. Does it change how good I train, how well I train? Not really. So the question there is, what was the value of it in terms of did I perform better or worse, or did it have zero impact whatsoever statistically? If it didn't have an impact, it wasn't worth the investment. And that's part of trying to do that earlier in the process, so we're saving everyone time and money, including the taxpayer. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, Brian Murphy from Wheeling College. Worked with some folks for PTSD, and they definitely reaffirmed the notion that
A little bit, yeah. Is that Khan University type thing, or? Go ahead.
I missed it. Okay. I was just curious, when you're thinking about AI, can you use that to help detect whether that person is ready for the next step in their knowledge stage?
So again, yes, but big caveat, right? If you set up the condition, to set up the system where it's actually accounting, for example, bless you, the Kirkpatrick model, to say, okay, what level am I actually measuring for? Is it applying to awareness? Am I actually gonna change my behavior because of this? If it's incorporating those kind of data science and like learning science, learning engineering principles, then yes, it can help achieve those outcomes. But if a person in the room, and I'm a SME from an aviation background perspective, if I didn't have instructional design, learning engineering background, or data science background, I said, yeah, I'm just gonna go build this thing and go test it, and it's because what I think is important. It goes back to my personal bias to that. I may cause the system, the AI itself, to not do what it's supposed to do. The AI is not at fault in that case. It's whoever programmed it to achieve an outcome may not have understood the problems that they're trying to solve for. Does that help?
Let me add something to this, if you don't mind. So, again, that's shiny toy syndrome with AI. What you're really trying to assess is progression over time across dimensions of interest. That can be anything depending on your field of study or training. So what you've probably noticed over the past decade is the emergence of biometrics to provide objective real-time indicator of competencies and performance. So that is another avenue with a lot more publications behind that shows the value of using real-time indicators from biosensors in order to predict, oh, okay, this individual is ready for the next module of instruction or whatever it may be. Does that help a little bit?
It does. I'm just curious because, Alice has been out in the marketplace for decades, over a decade at least, and it's been effective in helping kids think. So I would think that model
Yeah, so
not the normal space.
So Alex and Khan Academy, I think if there's empirical evidence showing they do statistically improve the 2 sigma problem, I think they're credible in that regard because the evidence is there. It's when they're new or something's changed, if they don't show that empirical evidence, that's a danger. But in those use cases, the ones I'm familiar with, they do have empirical evidence. They do demonstrably improve performance over time. So.
Yes, sir. Qualitative analysis, you said, yeah, incredibly important. Again, we're going to go back to the field studies we conducted a few years back with different militaries around the globe to assess some of those immersive systems. And the way we started quantifying the value was not only to look at can you train, can you reach the level of proficiency that you desire, but is it also effectively accepted by the body of users that have to undergo that training. So what we've done is simple survey instruments. Do you like the technology? Do you like this environment? What was good about it? What was bad about it? So your traditional survey instruments can be great because ideally what you want to show is acceptance from your trainees of a new technology and then see that positively translate into performance increment as well. So absolutely, this is necessary.
The thing I'd add to that is having subjective measure, qualitative analysis, not just quantitative, I know we're hitting on quantitative. It can tell you qualitative sentiment analysis, as Sandra mentioned, can indicate there's something there that may or may not be even a training issue, right? There might be managerial, there might be facility issues, there might be something wrong with the devices or instructor or something. So yes, having that qualitative data with the quantitative data, my stance is we have to have more quantitative data and less, I mean, we still have to do the qualitative 100%, but relying solely on qualitative, I'll be honest with you, like I used the example CBTs. I was a student going with CBTs, I hated them. Are they effective? Yeah. Did I enjoy them? Not at all. So while they're effective in training, they might get some dissonance in terms of what the sentiment is versus what the evidence shows. But in other cases, it's very good in showing, hey, there might be a problem here that you wouldn't see just from the empirical evidence itself. So definitely get both of those in there.
Oh, and another qualitative approach that we're very fond of are focus groups. And when you introduce a new technology in an environment, you need to get those participants into a room and then, go through the motions of asking what they liked and what disliked. And then you can code, you can do information analysis coding with certain human factors methods that allow you to create dimensions. If you're interested in this approach, actually my paper on Wednesday, shameless plug, will go over some of that.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'm stealing this one. Hey, good job, man. Yeah. This one's, what's this one?